Right, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to come here, especially to talk about my favourite subject, things Pictish. The Farnell Stone and I have kind of known each other for quite a long time now because I was working as an education officer in Dundee Museum when the Angus District Museum Curator post became available. And to cut a long story short, I was fortunate enough to secure that district curator post in April 1977. And one of the first projects that we had was to completely restore and renovate the displays of Montrose Museum, which of course was at that time where the Farnell Stone lived. So that's where I first saw it, and it was one of the stones that possibly hadn't been illustrated a great deal in a lot of the literature, so there was quite a learning curve there with the stone. Anyway, I'll come back to that later about what happened to it, and try and go back to the beginning, or I should say, at least to when it was rediscovered by modern humans, as it were. Now, see if we can get the technology to work. All right, you know where you are, you're Farnell. That's just an artistic shot, I think. But anyway, in the summer of 1849, one Andrew Jarvis, and I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it, I've heard it pronounced all sorts of ways, a Brecon gentleman who was a very learned character, very interested in history, especially Angus history, published a great deal. Possibly our first Angus archaeologist, because he excavated all over the place, Aberlemno, etc. In the summer of 1849, he excavated this stone in the churchyard, only a few inches below the surface. Now, how it got there is a complete and utter mystery. I'll do my best, but the details of his excavation are scant in the extreme. In fact, I think I've just explained everything that he told us. And that's typical of the man, a great deal of detail when he discusses this and that, but very little about excavations. The same at Aberlemno, where I think he was the first to excavate the roadside cross slabs and the symbol stone to discover that there had been burials there, and he tells you what might have been found, but nobody knows where that ended up. Anyway, that's enough about him. So the next sorry, I've just missed that one. Yeah, no, we've got him. Yeah. So I had a good look for Andrew Jarvis, an illustration of. So what you see here is an engraving made, and he's actually signed it as well. And you'll see that the engraving, which will have been made from an oil portrait, is him actually holding a Bronze Age pot in his hands. And that gave me a clue because it was found in the grounds of Hospital Field House in Arbroath. Again, I won't bore you with how I found this out, but anyway, on a visit to Hospital Field House one day, discovered there was his portrait, an oil portrait hanging in Hospital Field House itself, and the pot, believe it or not, was on the shelf adjacent, so it was still there. Now, I don't want to decry the staff of Hospital Field House at all, but they didn't really know much about Andrew Jarvis. But I did point out to them, this is a really important guy. In fact, this portrait would probably be in the National Gallery if it had been found there, but it's still in Hospital Field. It was the last time I looked, anyway. So, great chap to have about, and there we go. Now, sorry, that's not the best of photographs. It's quite high up, and there's a lot of reflection, and you really needed can't remember what you call these things, flash, that's it, to get a photograph, but it doesn't help. But there he is, I think he probably needs a wee bit of work, but never mind, he's safe enough. And the interesting thing is that Patrick Allen of Fraser, who was Patrick Allen until he married into the family and had to take the surname Fraser, he was a bit of an artist himself, and it's Fraser who's actually painted the portrait. So hence it's remained in Hospital Field. The engraving is by a T. Oldham Barlow, if I go back. Yeah, but engravings are founded on the actual painting itself. So that was the man who excavated it. And all I can say is that it's a complete mystery how the stone got there. It was only a few inches below the surface, which suggests that it hadn't been there all that long. There's no record of a collar stone which would have held it up. There's no evidence of a crack or a break at the bottom where it would have tipped over if it had been blown over. It makes you think that it had been laid flat, but where did it come from? The church, as most of you probably well know, was built on or near the older church. So it might have been there before this particular building was built, or it could have come from somewhere else, but we'll come back to that. Atypically of Jarvis in his many writings, there's not an illustration of the Farnell Stone, and it's not till Patrick Chalmers comes along. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Now, I'm sorry about this. If anyone knows where a portrait of Patrick Chalmers of Albar is, I'd love to know about it. This is the only one I could find, and it's him of a very young man. I think he was a bit older than that when he actually illustrated the Farnell Stone. And as you'll see in a moment, he published a magnificent work called The Sculptured Monuments of the County of Angus, and it's in that the first illustration of the Farnell Stone ever appears. So just a wee bit about Patrick. Albar, of course, again, you'll know this, it's just to the south of Brechin. It's a fairly big estate, and he had a lot more to do with Brechin Cathedral than I think he did. But if you go to Aberlemno, Kirker Church, take your pick, you'll find that the family were regulars in Aberlemno, and this bronze plaque pretty well tells you a wee bit about the man. He never, a great many keep the title captain to their dying day, but he never used it. As you'll see, he was MP here, and he hardly ever says anything about that. And yet a long servant as that. But it's interesting that the bronze plaque, which was obviously written after he died, says more about the sculptured monuments of the County of Angus. And you'll see an Angus link come all the way through this, even at this national level, that the people that are connected with Angus and the Stone, you'll see this as we go along. And I'm going to claim a first. I've never heard anybody say any different, but the sculptured monuments of Angus is the first actual book on Pictish stones that was ever published, which is quite a big mark for Angus. It was published in 1848. Now, those of you who've been paying any attention will be thinking, hang on a minute, the book was published in 1848, and yet it's got an account of the finding of the stone and an illustration of it from the summer of 1849. Patrick was the kind of guy who, for completeness' sake, any stones that were found afterwards, he would have drawn and an account written and an extra sheaf of paper go into his 1848 book. Now, there were only 200 subscribers, and he must have passed these sheafs to the subscribers after the publication. And that includes the Inchbrayock stones also in Troy's Museum. So, well done him. So, will we look at the book? Now, I'm sorry, but my scanner takes A4. this is an imperial unit called, I think, a half elephant, which is, and I think I've got a tape measure there, but you can't read it. It's over 30 inches tall. I've actually had I bought one after I retired. I was never really meant to own such things when I was working, but I managed to get hold of one not long after I retired, and I had it restored and a box made for it. It's the largest book I've got. It doesn't fit in any shelf whatsoever. It's the genuine coffee table book, except there's no coffee table that I know of that's made as large as that. It's absolutely enormous. So most of the big books that I'll show you, the photographs have simply been taken with my phone. So the photography is not brilliant, but it gives you an idea. Absolutely enormous thing. Even turning pages is fun. Anyway, that's the title page. And that's the illustration. Don't worry if you can't see too much in the way of details, because we'll come to that. It's just important to let you see that first illustration. So we do know something about the artists, and I almost need David Henry here, who's been my co-conspirator in many publications when he was head man of Pinkfoot Press, not all that far away from us. And he'll pronounce this Polish artist's name better than I can, but it's something, well, I can get the Jakub bit, but the Cheremsky, you've got to almost cough and spit, was the artist. Strange to get someone like that to illustrate it, but fine. Anyway, this publication, very limited circulation, clearly. Nonetheless, there are copies in, well, there were copies anyway when I retired in most of the Angus libraries, but I'll not say too much there. That was the first, and it clearly excited, inspired, whatever, a great many other antiquarians to look rather wider, and indeed the next publication that it's illustrated in is called The Sculptured Stones of Scotland by one John Stewart. Now, Emma's not here, but John Stewart was born in Aberdeen. He graduated as an advocate. He became the first secretary of the Spalding Club, a club based in Aberdeen in the 1838-39 thereabouts, and it was particularly interested in publishing or republishing ancient works, and it was very successful in doing so. But it wound up in 1870, and because he'd been their first and only secretary and edited nearly all their works, they presented him with a painting, of which this is a terrible photograph. The painting was by a George Read, later Sir George Read, and amazingly, the man presented his work to the Montrose Natural History and Antiquarian Society, which at that time ran Montrose Museum. So he knew firsthand the Farnell Stone. He became an honorary member of the society, and then moved to Edinburgh, where he became the secretary of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, which is pretty high up, and moved to Edinburgh, obviously. But amazingly, I've just got to finish this tale about the portrait, because you would expect a portrait of someone of this magnitude again to be in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. It's not. They're very proud of the engraving they've got of it by Charles Bell, and it's an original engraving. And I thought, we know where the oil portrait is, because when I started the Montrose Museum in '77 again, we found this portrait in the Montrose Museum collections. How on earth does a man from Aberdeen who worked in Edinburgh and was a giant of antiquarian studies end up in Montrose? Well, we knew he was a Montrose Natural History and Antiquarian Society member, And the clue comes from there because his son-in-law was a John Woodward, who was the Episcopal minister of St Mary's and Peter's, or St Peter's and St Mary's, depending which way you want it. So one of his daughters had married this Episcopal minister and spent all of her subsequent life there. And after John's death and her death, one of her daughters in 1953 donated it to Montrose Museum. I mean, my eyes popped out of my head when I found that, because I thought, anyway, that's John. Now, as I speak, I managed to find a wee bit of funding to restore the portrait, and chatting to Emma, it's just gone off to restoration as we speak, and we hope early in the new year that it will come back to Montrose, and maybe people will find out a bit more about George Reid and the portrait, at least, following that. Right, well, he published a fairly enormous work as well. Great difficulty photographing this thing. As I say, I can't scan it, and it's kind of difficult because of the size of it to even hold it for you to see. But he actually published two works, volume 1 in 1856, and then volume 2 in 1867. I don't think it was ever planned to have two volumes. The reason being simply that in these 10 or 11 years, he'd amassed so much more information about other stones in Scotland that he had to come out with a second volume. We'll just look at volume 1. And again, you'll see the illustration's not vastly dissimilar from the one that Patrick Chalmers used. And this runs true in both publications, where the artist, or sometimes a copyist, is using pretty well the same illustration. I'll come back to what you can see on the stone at the moment, because none of the photographs or illustrations, I'm afraid, do it a great deal of justice, so I'll come to a later one for you. You probably have questions in your mind already. Anyway, plate 86 is Farnell, but it doesn't stop there. The Montrose Naturalistic and Antiquarian Society published annual reports, and again had these bound. It's not as large a publication as the ones we'll be looking at, but it's still something I can't lay on a scanner because I'd crack the spine of the book, so I've got to respect that. So, again, not vastly different illustration from the ones you've seen, but nonetheless, there it is in 1865. Now, something happens then. We know that after its discovery, that it went to, I think, the porch of Kinnaird Castle. Again, as far as I know, there's no picture of it in Kinnaird Castle. Lord Southesk was certainly a great supporter of the Montrose Society, but I think by 1865 he'd probably had enough of it in his porch. So, as president of NHS, he donated the stone to Montrose Museum, and it stood there until I came. So, if you look at the 1865 report, it records this very generous donation. And at that time, Montrose Museum had two of these stones from Inchbrayock, the island to the south, no longer an island, to the south of Montrose. So they were quite pleased with this. So that's pretty well the 19th century. But by the turn of the 20th century, a plot had been hatched to do a rather more scientific survey of stones in Scotland, and one Romilly Allen, who was taken on board as the researcher, and one Joseph Anderson, who was the keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, combined to produce an amazing work called The Early Christian Monuments of Scotland. Again, that's far too weighty a tome for my scanner, and it also would crack. But again, we get this Angus link running through, because Joseph Anderson, guess what? He was born in Arbroath. a keeper of the National Museum, born in Arbroath. Brilliant. With the further interest into Pictish stones from the founding of the Pictish Art Society in 1988 right through, again we have another Angus link, because David Henry, that I've previously mentioned, who ran Pinkfoot Press at Bulguise there, he did a reprint. The Early Christian Monuments was still a fairly small run, I think maybe 500 copies, I can't remember exactly. But the interest had grown, and these things were so difficult to get hold of, and indeed very expensive when they did come up, that David developed the idea of running a subscription to a new print, and in 2 volumes, because that thing's enormous. Wee bit of collaboration. He said, "Do you have copies of that in the libraries, Norman?" I said, "Absolutely." I said, "In fact, we've got the Arbroath Library one was actually presented to them by Joseph Anderson, and inside it's got a letter." So if you've fallen into the reprints, or have good luck to have one, you'll find that letter is actually reproduced in the publication. Anyway, Alan particularly took a far more scientific approach than any of his predecessors. And that's the page that illustrates the Farnell Stone. And for the first time, we've actually got a photograph of one side, albeit. We'll call that the front. I've been criticised for calling cross slabs front and back, and I'll just stick to my guns here. If it's got a cross on it, that's the front. It's a Christian stone. So the back is whatever else you put on the back. So I'll stick with front. But you'll see that he's not bothered about a photograph of the back. It's just an outline drawing. But you'll see that there's a fair bit of damage there, and we'll come to that in a moment. So that pretty well brings us into the 20th century, and there's not really much to report for a good many years. As I said earlier, I returned to Angus in 77, and we were fortunate to have a large bequest which enabled us to restore and update Montrose Museum with new displays. So the Farnell Stone, well, everything had to go from the museum, and that included the Farnell Stone. Everyone thinks that a museum curator just sits at a desk and that's about it. But some objects are very heavy, and I think I managed, including the marble bust of Lord Panmure, to move all of them myself, except for the Farnell Stone. It was on the floor near the front door, and it had cast iron supports to hold it in place. So it was the very last thing to be taken out of the museum. And what I'd negotiated at that point was with Gray's School of Art Sculpture Department to take it to Aberdeen, and I don't know that we used the word conservation. It was basically a bit of a tidy up, and try and remove some of the sort of concrete-like material to make it a bit more presentable. So that was all agreed. All we had to do was get it out of the museum and up to Aberdeen. The up to Aberdeen part was fairly easy. Getting out of the museum was another thing altogether. We managed to unscrew the supports, and I had a colleague, Ian McGowan, who was working in the museum with me, and I had 2 librarians, Alistair Sutherland and John Docherty. All 4 of us were keen hill walkers, very fit people. I won't name names, but there were people who played football and tennis, so they're all very fit guys. So we laid it down on the ground, and then we took a corner each, and I said, 1, 2, 3, lift. Nothing moved. Nothing moved. We tried several times, and we had to give up. So luckily I had a friend who was a manager in the Montrose docks. So I said, could you send some heavies round? So 4 very burly dockers appeared and lifted it up as if it was a matchbox and out the door. So off it went to Aberdeen. We had other professionals who brought it back, and after the museum was restored, it came back and was put up in a new island supports a little bit further into the museum than it had been before, but nonetheless on the same museum floor where it had been for over 100 years. That would normally be the end of the story, but no. Angus Council's economic development section had this brainwave. I can't take complete credit for it, but there'd been such a wave of interest in things Pictish that it was decided to set up something called Pictavia, which would be a visitor centre. I was taken on board as the consultant, but I didn't get any extra money for that, I have to say. But it was an exciting time. And what I did build in was I thought, I wasn't at all happy with the work that Grey School of Art had done. And so one of the conditions I had over the Farnell Stone going to Pictavia was that it should be restored. So that's the next day. So after all these years, there's it sitting in Montrose Museum. Again, don't worry too much about the photography. In fact, I wonder if I can step back a wee bit. I'll probably be too far away from the... No, I'll tell you more later. Anyway, there it is in Montrose Museum. The colour photograph doesn't really help very much. That's back as well. Oh, that's right, that's the one. I'll just stop there. I think I probably put a slide in a different order, but never mind. Now, I'm going to try and talk to this and point. Right, you can see there's a ring cross, which helps us date it. And various bits of obvious Celtic knotwork round about, and a few contorted animals. And on the back, it's got that lovely picture at the bottom, which has 2 serpents, and we can call them serpents here. On the symbol stones only, what they used to call the class 1s, the things that archaeologists call serpents are not serpents, they're snakes. In fact, to be precise, they're adders, the only native snake in Pictland. But here by this time, you're looking at a Christian stone with a cross, and these are indeed serpents. And if you need any confirmation about that this is a biblical term, the 2 people at the bottom there are Adam and Eve, and you'll see that the tree itself has apples on it. And if you look, I'm trying to remember who it is now, one of them's holding an apple, and the bottom right, where there should be an apple in the tree, isn't there. So it's the story of Adam and Eve. So we know from that this is clearly a Christian stone, and with many of these they've picked up a biblical theme to illustrate that on the back. But the ring cross gives us an idea that we're talking post-Iona. It's a proper ring cross, and its lack of Pictish symbols also tell us that it's post 900, or certainly post Kenneth MacAlpin anyway, late 9th century. Oh yeah, sorry, I should say that this is, that's the John Borland drawing of the Royal Commission of Ancient Historical Monuments of Scotland, now savagely, trying to think the right verb here, amalgamated with Historic Scotland by the Scottish Government. The drawings came about as a result, I'm trying to remember the year now, I'm sure you will remember it, the foot and mouth outbreak. It meant that the Royal Commission couldn't go out and do field work. So they checked with a great many museums, could we actually do some drawings of some of the stones you've got in museums? So they did all the Angus museums, including the Farnell one, and then they asked me if I would write a leaflet on the stones in the Angus museums, and it was illustrated by John Borland, who worked for them. He had a long title which I forget, but he illustrated these things, an incredible illustrator. I'll tell you more about him later. But so we published this for all the stones. So the Farnell Stone was properly drawn, and John was a very, very exact technician. To give you a wee example, we're going to look at the Brechin doorway. In fact, I may as well just go to that. Can always come back. After that publication, the Royal Commission also did one of Brechin Cathedral and its early Christian artefacts inside the cathedral, and indeed on the round tower itself. This is the doorway to the round tower, and it's an amazing piece of sculpture. In any case, I'm not going to go into length, but what I want you to look at are the pillets round the border. And when John was drawing this, he said, "Do you know, Norman, what's amazing? When you stand and look up at the doorway, the pellets at the bottom of the doorway are the same size as the pellets at the top. In other words," and there's a proper word for this, they get larger as they go up, so they look the same size when you're at the downstairs. I mean, what an amazing skill to do something like that. But the most important thing for me is rather that there are only two monuments in Pictland that have these pelleted borders. Brechin Cathedral, Brechin Round Tower doorway, and the back, these two monsters that meet head on at the top have pelleted bodies all the way down. And they're the only two. Now, that certainly brings me to think, well, Farnell was in Brechin Diocese when Brechin was created by David First as a cathedral in 1150. We know it was on the go in the reign of Kenneth II, 971-995. He it was who gave the great city of Brechin the Lord. That's in an early text, probably originally written in not long after 995. Now, whether the Round Tower was built then or after, there's still a debate about that. But the link for me is that this connection between Brechin and Farnell may well have belonged, as it were, to Brechin long before it became a cathedral, and perhaps the two stones are close in date. But which came first, the Farnell Stone or the Round Tower doorway? I think earlier writings that I've made about the Farnell Stone, I've dated it to 9th or 10th century, and I'd like to revise that a wee bit. A good friend of mine who wrote the book on the Manx crosses said, "Norman, there's an awful lot of time in here. There's a big gap between the late 9th century and, say, 1100 or thereabouts." So I would tend to think that the Farnell Stone probably is more 10th century. It might even be a wee bit later. I don't suppose we'll ever know. But then science has a habit of moving on, and while we can't date stone sculptures at the moment, who knows? Someone may yet work out when sculptures are actually made. So that might be discovered in years to come. Who knows? Anyway, to return to the wanderings of the stone. As I said, in 1999, it had to go down to the National Museums of Scotland for conservation, restoration almost, and it went to the National Museum workshops. So these few pictures here, I wish I'd had it, or wish I'd done that when it moved to Grays actually, but this is it going from Montrose Museum to the National Museums of Scotland in Edinburgh in 1909. So, took 3 men, but they had a big machine. I have to say they did a fairly good job. Certainly did a lot better than the tailor's van. Anyway, down it went, and there are a whole pile of photographs of it in the workshops. But the important thing from your point of view was to get rid of all these repairs, the cover up at Grays, and most importantly, whatever Southwest had done to it after the summer of '49. I don't know if I can use the word concrete, but something that looked like concrete put the bits of stone together. Whether it had already been broken in the ground or whether it was broken lifting up, who knows. But it obviously didn't have the type of care which it got at NMS in '99. And it then returned to Pictavia, and you'll probably know that Pictavia eventually closed, and all the stones that were in it returned to the museums, and all the interpretation, whatever, went to, with a little bit of help from you know who, went to Aberlemno, and they now have a Pictish room with all that, which we saved. But sadly, the Farnell Stone came back to Montrose Museum, and the architects decided that the load-bearing floor, where it stood for over a century, was no longer able to hold it. And sadly, it's been in store since then. The only Pictish stone in the Angus collections that's not out on display, which is a great shame. You can maybe rewrite that, but I'll stop there on that one. But you might... Yeah, that's it. The broken bit actually restored there. They've done a very good job. And the great thing about that is you can see clearly where the actual stone is and where the inserts, the repair, is as well. But just a little bit of interest. A researcher by the surname of Eales, I think it's Francis Eales, in 1910 discovered 2 cross-headed stones in Farnell Kirkyard, and that's the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquities of Scotland article that he wrote, just a couple of pages, with illustrations of these ring-headed crosses. Now again, they're probably 10th or 11th century, thereabouts, and they were laid against the north wall of the church. And I searched for them certainly in the 80s, and your Reverend Joe Perry, I think, helped me, but unsuccessfully, and goodness knows where they went. But that's a shame, because they're just a wee bit of evidence that there were other sculptures in this kirkyard as well. Right, where did it come from? Our stone. Now, I'll try and find this. That's it there. That's the first edition Ordnance Survey map, surveyed in the 1860s, and it shows site of St Rooms Cross. Now, they have it as Rooms Cross, and it's in the old name book as Rooms Cross, but I do know it's been called all sorts of other things in other publication, but I've stuck to that one because it's fairly secure, the way of naming it. The Ordnance Survey at the time, what they would do was interview local people, quite often landowners or people who live very close by. What's the name of this hill here? And they would give them the name and write it down, and you actually have the evidence. And National Records of Scotland have made the old name books available on their site now, so you can actually find that for yourself if you're interested in how place names came about, so you can actually look at that yourself. So who on earth was St. Room? Now I know that later, certainly 19th and even some 20th century publications will tell you that this kirk is donated to St. Ninian's. There is absolutely no contemporary proof of that whatsoever. Ninian was quite often known as Ringen in Scots, and I think Ringen and Rumen are so close that I think that's probably how it's moved along. So I'm sticking to St. Room. Who on earth is St. Room? Well, amazingly, we do have a little bit of nearby evidence. I had an awful job getting a photograph of this. I had to chop my way through brambles. It's funny that an organisation that looks after woodland can't actually cut down a few plants so you can see the notice, but I better not go there. Anyway, again, if you're a local, always listen to locals, especially ones who have been there for a long time or whose family have been there a long time, to get pronunciation. The best example I can give you is the number of so-called Gaelic experts that try to fathom what forfar means, and they pronounce it forfar. Well, most of you will know Forfarians don't pronounce it forfar, it's farfar. So where does farfar come from? Montreathment Moor. I've never heard a local pronounce that. It's Monrimmen, Moor of Rumen, or at least. Now, I didn't invent this. We need to go back to Andrew Jarvis. That's what he said in the 1850s. So he's probably on the right track. But does Rumen stand up? How many Rumens are there? And one Alexander Penrose Forbes, who was the Bishop of Brechin, wrote another enormous tome. I haven't photographed this one, called The Saints of Scotland or something like that. And he has all the Scottish saints in this book. You may not be able to read this one, but anyway, that's the St. Rumen entry. I'm not too worried about the details, because you get all sorts of saints here that need not necessarily be our lot. And if you need a wee example, you only need to look to the west of Glamis, where you get St. Orland's cross, and you have a cross slab, maybe a wee bit earlier than our one. But St. Orland, you won't find a St. Orland in any book on saints whatsoever. Why would that be a surprise? It's a Pictish saint, and it's a 9th century Pictish saint, and there's no record of these. The Scots and Gaels who moved in here in the 9th and 10th centuries weren't interested in the saints of the Picts, they were interested in the saints of the Scots. So to the victor goes the spoils. So you will get Pictish saints who won't appear in any written history whatsoever, and perhaps this Rumen is one of these as well. So I'm not too hot on that. Anyway, now I'm quite happy to answer questions on Farnell, but I want to finish. I hope I'm not running over time here. I want to finish because the last meeting I had with your elders and betters here, we had a chat about various things, including the Reverend Dr. Hugh Mitchell. So this is not about Farnell Stone, but hopefully something still of interest. Rev Hugh Mitchell became a Free Church minister in the parish of Craig, and his main claim, well, one of his main claims to fame was getting these errant ferried-in fishermen to behave themselves, and he most certainly had put the fear of God into them, well, maybe more appropriately, the fear of Hugh Mitchell into them, which gave him time to get on with the real job, fossil hunting. his collection was enormous. A lot of it went to Montrose Museum, a great deal of it went to the National Museum of Scotland, Royal Scottish as it was then. His remarkable career produced a great many fossils of huge interest to geologists across the world. He was born in 1822 in Aberdeenshire, and although he retired to Aberdeen only a couple of years after that, sadly he died in 1894. Montrose Museum, though, has the portrait. Rachel Bendy, ex-curator, till I retired anyway, reckons that there's another portrait of him. But anyway, that's of him as a younger man, perhaps. I presume he had it donated. I've no idea who the artist is, but he was certainly a character. You won't be able to read it, it doesn't matter. I managed to find half of an obituary that Cambridge had stuck on the internet, but I don't. That's fairly heady stuff, and it's not really the main point, because the Farnell connection is fascinating. Again, you don't have to read this, but I can tell you what it is. The illustration that there is of the top part of the tiny fish that he found. It was renamed in his honour in 1859 by one of the top experts of the day, and it was known as Acanthodes mitchelli. It was found in the lower Old Red Sandstone of Angus. You're talking a couple 100 million years old, and by memory, I think it was the first fossil fish found, full stop. So pretty good going. This account is actually in Duncan Fraser's East Coast Oil Town, which was published in 1974. It's still available. Duncan Fraser was the editor of I think both Montrose newspapers at the time. But the story of the finding of the fossil is amazing. Now that's a drawing that's actually made when he finds it. It's just a tiny fish about a couple inches long, but a very, very spiny fish. And how he found it, everybody walked in these days, so he'd walked from the manse in Craig to Farnell to christen a baby. But on getting there, he discovered that the father hadn't returned from his work, so he was asked to wait. And he must have thought to himself, might as well do something useful while I'm here. So he borrowed a hammer, because he wasn't actually on a geological expedition at that time. So he borrowed a hammer from the farmhouse, and off he went to Farnland Quarry, chipped away, and to his amazement found this little fish, perfectly formed in the sandstone. So excited was he that he went home not only with the fish, but also with the hammer, and forgot all about the christening. So amazing story. Anyway, you can read it for yourself in Duncan Fraser. So you've got an interesting stone there as well. As far as I know, the type specimen is in the National Museum of Scotland now. I looked at it way back in the 80s, I think, but not since. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I'll go back, I think, to the picture stone. I'm quite happy to try and answer any questions if you have any.
I have a question, if I may. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I thought that was fantastic. I sort of hung on your every word, so that was really interesting. At some point you said that we've no sort of forensic or scientific way of dating a carving such as this. So therefore, why do people like you and other historians believe that it emerged or was made in the 9th or 10th century? What is it that...
Yeah. Well, the first bit, that's wishful thinking. I'm hoping that one day they will find a way to date it. Dating of sculpture like this is usually done by art historians. I have some good friends who are art historians, so I don't want to say too much, but my inspiration has always been Isabel Henderson, who wrote a little book in 1967 called The Picts, and towards the end of her career she retired from Cambridge University. She wrote a book with her husband on the art of the Picts, which was about 40 quid's worth about 10 years ago, and her position hasn't changed, but Isabel dates things on stylistic grounds. So sometimes, if you're really, really lucky, an excavation might reveal a stone in its original place, and then you maybe have carboniferous material that you can date. For example, the big so-called Sweno stone at Forest, that 23-foot monolith, before they put the stupid glass box round it, and anybody with a glass house would know what would happen then, they did excavations round the base, and the post holes which would have been there to support the wooden uprights had left a carboniferous deposit, and surprise, surprise, it came out at the late 9th century. Yeah. So that's a cracker, and that's like the Farnell Stone. It doesn't have Pictish symbols on it, but it's certainly in the Pictish idiom, and they've tried to tie that then to historical events. They can't really pin it down exactly, whether it's the Scots invasion of the province of Murray, or whether it's indeed a Viking invasion of Burghead, they don't know. So it's not always easy to tie all these things together, and unfortunately we don't have that kind of information for Farnell. But Isabel, we often shared podiums way back in the day, and she was kind enough to give me two little comments. She said, "Hang on to history, Norman. You know your way around history. There aren't many people who do that. Ignore archaeologists, and most of all, ignore art historians." so I'm probably offended just about everybody. But you do find that even contemporary sources are misread or misinterpreted by both, and I don't pretend to be an art historian, because theories that were all the go in the 70s and 80s are no longer. They've changed, and some actually have come all the way back. So the ideal would be for me if someone could find how to date an actual carving. That would be wonderful. Just when that chisel hit that piece of stone, that would be wonderful. But let's face it, we didn't. No one knew that there would be carbon dating. Before carbon dating, it was an amazing. It was very difficult to do, and it came along as a very amazing way of dating things. So hopefully there'll be a similar discovery at some point.
Thank you.
Yes.
Two questions, really. I mean, we have Adam and Eve and the apple tree. Where did two serpents come from? One question.
Balance.
Well, yes, I can kind of understand that. But with lots of religious iconography, certainly later in time, I'm going to art history, if there's a saint involved, there's a story associated with a particular saint. Mm-hmm. So is there anywhere on that stone that there's a story that could be linked to a particular saint, hence it got the name?
Mm-hmm. No, I can't think of a single stone with any connection to a saint.
It seems to me that lots of the picture stones that we see around Angus are pictures of battles.
And hunting scenes, but
yes.
Certainly the reverse of most cross slabs will will have something akin to a hunting scene, and it's that side that you'll find the symbols on, and you'll nearly always find a large figure at the top with the best hairdo, the best dress, and that'll be the king or leader or warrior, whatever. And sometimes, as in the Aberlemno so-called battle stone, you'll actually get a picture of the battle again with the king at the top. So it's the sponsor, not the saint, who's going to get their mark on it, you know. Why a biblical scene was chosen for this one, I know not. But the only stone I can think of where it was purported that there was a saint on it was, again going back to the forest stone on the front side. There seems to be an inauguration scene where a seated king has been crowned or anointed, well, probably not anointed, crowned, and it was reputedly at Columba, but if that's 9th century, then it couldn't have been Columba. He died in 697, so no, it tends to be the patron, because let's face it, these stones would have cost quite a bit in, you know, specialised man hours to erect. Never mind the quarrying of it and setting them up. If you're really, really lucky, you get an inscription, and there are a few in Angus that do have, and the one that springs to mind would be the so-called Drossen stone at St Vigin's, where on the side at the bottom of the cross, which we know is, again, stylistically mid-9th century, the inscription reads, Drosten ippe voret et forcus, and most scholars accept that there are 3 names in there, Drosten, voret, and forcus. And there are a limited number of Drostens, an even more limited number of forcuses. And we have one Drosten who is not only king, but he's the son of a king called Voret, very similar name. We're not really sure who Forcus is, but again, my simple explanation would be that Drosten probably had this stone set up in memory of his father. That's the most likely one. But you get and that's in a kind of Latinised text, but the Picts didn't really have a written language in that sense, and they would have been reliant on Gallic clerics who could write, and then sculptors who could transfer that to stone. So it gets a bit mangled, especially because the languages were a wee bit different anyway. So it's, unfortunately, there's not and I think a lot of dedications of churches may have come later, and indeed in some cases, if you take Brechin as an example, in my view, changed by the regular clergy who didn't like names like Ternan, and it ended up being Trinity, the Holy Trinity. Any Brechin will tell you there's a place called Tarnity. The sign says Trinity, but Tarnity is how you pronounce it. And guess what? There's a chapel in the slightly later medieval period called St Ternan's. So I think you've had a nice change there, because the Trinity to the later medieval clergy sounded a far better thing to have connected with the cathedral than this Ternan. Who on earth was this Ternan? So, but then Ternan we know from other places, Bankery Ternan, for a start, not all that far away. Sorry, I'm way off the answer. Yes.
You said that on your Farnell Stone and around the door in Brechin, around Brechin, was skeleton. Was there a reason for that? Was it just decoration?
Just decoration, I would think.
And is that just wee holes?
Yeah, they're actually proud. They're actually sitting proud of the background rather than the whole. But it's just a fashion thing. What you tend to find is that people copy designs from all over, and the English, particularly the Northern English, Northumbrians, the Irish, the Norse, the Danes, the Scots and the Picts all share an awful lot of images. The only thing that stands out with the Picts, and sadly not on the Farnell Stone, is their symbols, which are utterly unique. There's none of the other sort of North Europeans are using anything like that. But a lot of their knotwork and key pattern, their intertwined animals that the Corries used on their LP covers, Lindisfarne Gospels, all that is common to that whole area. And it's actually been a tremendous way of discovering Pictish art, because a lot of the raids that the Vikings had in this part of the world, they plundered a great many of the churches for their silverware, and a lot of that ended up on the mainland of Europe. And there was a superb exhibition a few years ago now, in Edinburgh in the National Museum, which was called The Work of Angels, and they managed to get gold and silver from all across Europe, some of it with designs that you think, that wouldn't look out of place here, but of course we don't have any of that. All the silver and gold was pinched or melted down, whatever. We've very, very few artefacts that have survived, and those that have are all in the National Museum now. Yes?
What's the Pictish stones actually for? Were they their calling card?
Yeah, I think the experts still argue about that. I think one of the problems is that everyone's lumped all the stones into one bag, as it were, and I think they have different reasons. I don't think they're necessarily marking the spot of a burial. I think that's unlikely, but they could have been most likely put up in the honour of a deceased king or Mormaer. And if you look at a place like Aberlemno, you have a continuity of burial in that area from the very, very early symbol stones, such as the one on the roadside. It's called the Serpent Stone, but it's actually got an adder on it, which is probably 7th century or thereabouts, all the way through to the Battle Stone, and then the big roadside cross slab that was blown down in that gale last year, earlier this year, sorry. So they're probably marking the sanctuary area of the church, and again, because they required a patron, they were probably put up there by son of somebody important. For example, the Battle Stone in the Aberlemno Kirkyard is 685 is the date of the battle, but the stone doesn't look like it's been put up for some years after that. But it's still been big enough in the memory, and indeed might have taken quite a while to construct. I think the other thing that they discovered in a study again, which happened largely because of foot and mouth. A lot of work was done by National Museum, and then Nigel Ruffley, again an Angus connection. Nigel lived in Kirkbuddow. They worked on the potential quarries, or at least stone beds, where some of these stones came from, and they didn't come from just 2 yards down the burn, as it were. They sometimes came a few miles. They had picked out the right kind of stone they wanted, and then they had to travel it. Just imagine that. They had to get it there in one piece, more or less, one decent piece anyway, when there were no roads, and goodness knows how it got there. And then work would start on the site itself, because you don't carve stones and then carry them, because they're going to fall to bits, and that's an expensive business. But so I don't think they marked individual graves. Although some of these early ones, who knows. But just as when I mentioned Andrew Jarvis way back at the start, when he excavated the base of the roadside stones, what he did find was that, especially with the symbol one, there had been a burial nearby, but it had obviously been plundered, because I mean, a stone like that, you know, beneath this there could be gold. So somebody had obviously had a wee dig there, and if there was anything, it'd gone, you know. And so many of them are found far, far from where they're originally placed that it makes it even more complicated. So I've probably just confused you. I'm sorry. No one really knows for sure. The one, Professor Gordon Noble of Aberdeen University has done some amazing excavations, and the one that the Mother Tap, that huge hill fort in Aberdeenshire, and the cross stane that's named, I suppose because a crow stood in it, I don't know. He excavated both the hill fort and the stone was in its original place, and you could prove that with various, again, carbon dating of stuff round about. But the connection between the stone and the hill fort, who knows? Was it put up in honour of some chieftain? We may never know the answer to these things.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a couple of questions about the carvings and the sculptures themselves. What are the two monsters at the top? What do they symbolise? And also, is there any significance to the three different kinds of knotwork?
Sadly, I don't think so. You tend to find a lot of the cross slabs, particularly through the 8th and 9th centuries, they like a border, and they just like the idea of two beasts joining the top, and then the tails go down and round the bottom. But as I say, the pelleting's the interesting one for me, and the Farnell one. How you fill the cross itself, or the shaft, and sometimes the adjoining bits, just seems to be a matter of taste. The big cross slabs, it doesn't work on that one, but the big cross slabs, you tend to find that the shaft itself is a slightly different pattern to the cross, because the cross is usually, in Pictland anyway, is normally an equal armed cross. But remember that these guys didn't work with compasses and tape measures. It was all done by hand. I don't know if any of you have bumped into David McGovern, who's Maniki rock art, and David has done more reconstructions of Pictish stones, and more Pictish stones, stones in the Pictish idiom as well than anybody. And because he's a stone carver himself, he knows that these people are using, tempered steel, much as we would do now. So they were skilled craftsmen. And what I like about David is that if you've ever seen him work, again, he only goes on rough measurements. A lot of it is just done with his hand. He does a circle like that. I mean, I find it hard to cut a straight line with scissors, So, yeah, amazing. But no, it's just a matter of taste. Sometimes, as I say, you can tell the shaft from the actual cross, the cross arms themselves, but often, in this case, not at all. It's just all one. And in some ways, we've got to be grateful, because the transfer of symbols on a water-worn stone, incised, to a slab where you cut it, square it, and then not in size, but actually carve in relief, is, thanks to the Northumbrians. That's where we picked up the idea, because they were making stones, cross slabs like that, in the 7th century. What it meant for us was that there was space, never mind filler alongside or above or in the cross itself, but you had the back of the stone to tell the story. And we've learned more about the backs of stones, maybe not so much with the Farnell one, because it's a biblical story. No disrespect by that, but the likes of Aberlemno or Glams, you've got all that information on the back about a hunting scene, the back of the scene. You get to learn what these guys are wearing, how their horses are decked out, the weapons they have, and you don't have that level of information about other people's, other than through excavations. So there's a plus side to that as well.
Any more questions?
Do you think it's practical for us to think of housing the stone here at Farnell?
Yes, I think so. I have to say I'm horrified at the numbers I've seen. But given the 1999 conservation of the stone in the National Museum cost me £450, and I passed that bill on to economic development, so again it didn't cost me anything. So it's a large sum of money, but I think the critical thing, I think, as I've said to you, is that the work that's been done on the stone is such that it couldn't sit outside anymore. That there are just too many things going on that would harm it. So it would have to be indoors, but I think that's perfectly feasible. When I was president of the Pictish Arts Society, we founded a small fund to help, quite often churches, redisplay stones. Sometimes stones that had always been outside, perhaps in a wall or something like that, and sometimes stones that were inside but just needed better presentation, as it were. And that's helped in a small way quite a lot of churches throughout the north and east of Scotland. I'm not suggesting for a moment that PS would have enough money to help me there, but you never know, they might make a donation. But it can be done, and other churches I know have displayed it inside the church, removed a few pews, and that's caused all sorts of issues, which I fully understand. But I've often, on my wanderings, had to go around and have a chat sometimes with the church politicians, if indeed that's what they are, church managers, whichever, and say, well, look, this is the earliest representation we have here of Christianity on this spot. Is that not important? And in many ways, I feel a bit like a gamekeeper turned poacher, because although we, and I, gathered a great many of these stones into museums, in the words of Historic Scotland, as a last resort. And I remember doing a paper on the centenary of the early Christian monuments of Scotland called Curators of the Last Resort. I should have had a cowboy hat on, I don't know, but I thought, well, museums are important in preserving them when there is no other way. But if there is a way of keeping an artefact like that where it belongs, that's a big thing to aim for, I would say. I don't know that you have to spend 35,000 on that, though. That sounds a bit scary to me, you know. I've probably offended a great many people now, not sitting here. But yeah, I mean, I managed to get that work done for 450 quid 26 years ago. So, I mean, the stone as it is just now, I would say would last quite a bit. You know, I think it's more getting a nice home for it, but you might have to. I don't know what's happened to the old supports, but it's got a pretty damning report, I think, from the conservators. But
I asked also if you're willing to write up the talk that you've just given to us, so that we could have a more permanent record of what you say.
Yes, well,
Publish it here.
yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. I think that I've learned in my career that talking and writing are two very different skills, and I have to write in a very different way, because that's a really permanent record. Also, you've got to know who you're writing it for. I mean, I would like to think that whatever we publish is one thing, but I would like to think that if the stone does come back here, and I hope it does, that you have a little a label or a little leaflet or something that the general public can read as well and understand, because I've maybe assumed a lot in my talk here, and for that I apologise, but I think a few of you knew a few bits about the Farnell Stone already, but to a visitor it might be that you write it in a way that they would understand the background a bit better. I also write in...
You see the real value, or the value that in your eyes would be realistic for Farnell to look at in a project that you were looking at 30 500,
Yeah.
we're surely not seeing inflation at that level.
No. I think I mean I would accept that a lot has moved on from '99, but I think we live in a different kind of society now. In the 20th century, there was what you would call a museum curator community, and the National Museum and a great many provincial museums worked together as friends, and you tried very hard to help rather than just rip off. So I think that 458 quid probably didn't represent the amount of time that the conservators spent on it, but they wanted to do a good job, you know, and it didn't seem out of order at the time, but I can remember one of the Kirriemuir stones that we had restored by the same person actually, not the museum, the one that's looked at it more recently, but that stone was just in pieces, and I can't remember the sum of money, but it was considerably more than a few £100 anyway. But it was probably a 100-piece three-dimensional jigsaw, and it was an amazing bit of work to put it all together. I don't think this represents the same thing, but I'm not an expert in the conservation, but you know, looking at the report which the museum still has by the National Museum of Scotland in 1999, you can see exactly what they've done to the stone. I don't know whether that's been shared with the conservator that's provided the estimate or not, but that might be worth looking at.
It's half a cake would be better than no cake at all.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, it's horses for courses as well, because unless something terrible has happened to it since I last saw it, then I would have thought it wouldn't require a heck of a lot to redisplay. Whereas if you look at the big roadside cross slab that the wind blew down at Aberlemno, that is a big job, because although I've not seen the damage or not seen all of it, there's a lot of work required there to put things back together again, and then comes the difficulty of, do you replace it? Do you put it back to where it lived, or what do you do? You know. So anyway, that's moving off the point. But no, I can't offer you a competitive quote either, because I couldn't. I don't know whether the National Museum would take it on or not. But again, it's a very different regime in 25 to what it was in 99. So.
Will you have your portrait done?
Sorry?
Will you have your portrait Make sure it goes into the right art gallery.
Would you not be better getting a sculpture done?
Oh dear. Sorry, I'm too modest to reply to either of these.
Well, thank you. It's a wee vote of thanks. That was a wonderful talk. I think you had everyone in the palm of your hand there, and it's also so lovely to hear about how important Angus is in our national history, and how Angus has been the centre of so much of this, Pictish history in particular. So a wee round of applause and thank you.